Okay, it's me again. REST. A certain gentleman, I don't remember his name, decided that the implementations for the web service environment were far too complicated in his opinion. So he came up with a new architecture, which is called REST, and it's based on HTTP requests and based on what's basically in the URI. So the central concept is that you're requesting what you want, who you're talking to through what's in the URI, and you specify all the parameters on it to say these are the aspects that I'm talking about. We'll look at that in a minute. And basically, HTTP request, you issue them either as a get, a post, a put, or a delete. Previously, we only handled get, post in the Jade HTTP world, but the other two. So the idea of this is that these verbs reflect what you're trying to do. The get, obviously, is you're retrieving something. Delete is obviously deleting something. And I put the post, I can never remember which way around they are. One is the create of an object and one is the update of an object. But how you actually implement that in your system is probably up to you, because in the end you're calling a method, and what you do in that method is how you implement that aspect. So examples of a REST URI, and pretty much they're all the same. You're saying, I want to get an employee, the employee number 12345, and you're saying that via this URI, and you know the first part is how do I get to the server that's going to offer this service, and the rest of it is that's the noun essentially that you're dealing with. And any slashes after that are the parameters that you're specifying for this request. So if you pass that through with a get HTTP request, then you're saying essentially, by definition, I want to retrieve the definition of that employee, if it exists. If you want to delete that employee, then you send exactly the same URI, except this time you send it with a delete HTTP request. And so you're implying that I want this code, that employee number, to be removed. And so on. So if you send it through with a put, and there we go, you're saying that you're going to pass through, well, not only you send the URI, but you're also attaching a set of XML or JSON definition that describes that employee, that you're going to, which is actually going to update the existing employee 12345. Create then is exactly the same, except you're doing it with a post. So one day I'll remember which way around they are. Now, if I want to retrieve a set, all of the employees or a collection of all employees, then again, you could have a different URI, send it in with a request, and what you get back is an array of employees. The other aspects of the REST services is that it's stateless. So there is nothing held between consecutive requests. We're not holding a session and continuing the session. Each request is independent, or meant to be independent. And REST also does not offer an exposure. So this is not Jade. This is the way that the REST implementation has been defined, or not defined, if you want to call it that way, out there in the world. So the other thing that a REST service does is when you send in a request, it also sets a thing called HTTP status to indicate what happened. Did it succeed or did it fail? And if it did fail, how did it fail? And so by default, you get the 200 back saying, yep, I got that customer. Yes, I did that update. Yes, I created that brand new customer, whatever. Whereas the 404 is meant to indicate, is telling the client that, no, I couldn't find that customer. Now you'll see that in Jade, it's up to you. You can define your application to use this or not. It's up to you. It's up to the way you want to design your system. But this is the way that REST is supposedly meant to work. So when we get to Jade, we have the URL that's pretty much the same as what you would send for talking to Jade Web Services as it stands. We have, the address of how do I get to the server that I want. I'm talking through the Jade HTTP DLL as normal. And here's my noun. I'm dealing with a person. I'm doing something with a person. And every slash after that are the parameters that are going to be passed through to the method that I'll eventually call. And I can also indicate how I want the response. Do I want it in XML or in JSON? There's two types of JSON. And then finally, here's the application that we're talking to. So that's what's going to appear in your Jade HTTP ini file, same section, pretty much the same as you would normally define a web service. Okay, so to create this service, the developer goes to their user schema and creates a subclass of the new root schema class called Jade REST Service. That subclass will hold all the methods that are going to be called by this service. And then we have to define an application. There are two new application types. That is a REST, saying it's a REST service application that's pretty much the same as you would for a web service. And you have to tell that application that you want to use this subclass as my designation for the service. So when we get a request from the web, the first name in that URI that we hit, in this case it was person, is used to build the method name that's going to be called based on the verb. So the get, post, delete, put will all be converted to lowercase, appended to the noun that we're dealing with, which the first character will be uppercased. So we end up with get person. That method will be defined on that class that the subclass of Jade REST services that we defined. And you define that method with the parameters that you expect, which then have to be passed through as that URI. So in the get person case, we would expect one parameter being the ID of the person that we want. And you would define the return type of the method as being a person, saying I'm going to return the person back to the web service. Now these methods, you can have one parameter that's an object. Now the object will be built, when you say you have an object as a parameter on the method, you will go looking for either an XML or a JSON. We'll look for both in fact. And build the object from that definition. Now that object might be an array of objects, or it might be a single object that has children objects and a whole hierarchy of objects associated. And that will all be built from the XML and the JSON that will be received. The value that you return from the method will be encoded into XML or JSON. That return type could be a string, could be an object, could be an array, whatever it is. It will be encoded and sent back to the caller. Now the structure of the framework is exactly the same as you were used to with web services. You have usually IIS, can go through Apache, using HTTP, HTTPS, through the server, through the Jade HTTP. You have 1 to n copies of the web application, the REST service web application running in your server. You receive a request, it's shoveled through to a free copy of that application, it processes it, and returns it back to the user. So all the parameters that you can assign for the Jade HTTP DLL apply for REST. So you can say minimum, maximum copies and timeouts and all the other things that are in there. And as I said, that's the application name that you're going to talk to that you stick in the any file for the Jade HTTP to define that service. So when Jade receives the request, it builds up the method name to be called, finds it, it's not there, it gets an exception. It will convert all the additional path parts of the URI into the parameter types that are expected. So Jade will go through each parameter type and say, okay, I'm expecting an integer, convert the string to an integer, and make sure it is an integer, and so on. And when it hits an object parameter, it will go looking for the JSON or the XML to be parsed and to be created into that object with any child objects that are also attached to that. When the message is received, we go looking for, and we need to find the contents, an XML or JSON contents. We search for the XML tag to find the start of the XML that's going to be processed, and that has to be the last part of the message that's received. So the XML tag, whatever's in front of that, we're going to ignore. We process the rest of it as the XML. Parse that. Unfortunately, JSON, depending on what version of JSON you're dealing with, has different syntax. The Microsoft syntax and the Newton syntax is different. So that Newton will actually use square brackets around arrays, whereas Microsoft put the curly brackets. So you end up with different syntax. So to work out where the start of the JSON is a little more complex, a little more hit and miss, because we have to find the first one of these to say, okay, that's where it starts. When we parse that JSON or XML, we will ignore any classes that are referenced that we know nothing about, or any properties that we know nothing about. So that means that if you've actually got a client that's dealing with an old version of the schema that's different to yours, basically they're going to be passing in a different subset or a different set of properties than what you expect, and we'll ignore anything that's not currently in that schema. The unfortunate part about JSON is that JSON does not have a header to tell you what it is. So the fact that it's an employee, you don't know that this JSON represents an employee. So what Jade does is use the object parameter that it finds. It says, okay, this is an employee, therefore the JSON must be an employee. But if somebody sent you the wrong message, then the first part is going to apply. We're going to say, oh, I don't know what that property is, I don't know what that property is. So there's scope for mismatches, let's put it that way. And it's a strange concept for me that JSON doesn't have a header to tell you what it is. Annoying as well. Okay, so anything that's being passed through, we're going to validate against the expected types that, excuse me, so if you pass a obviously this is coming in as a string, so you pass a property equals value of, and it's not a numeric, and we're expecting a numeric, then we're going to give an exception. There are three types of styles, and we'll talk about that in a minute. What the differences are, XML and two versions of JSON that we handle. Now when you start your application, your REST service application, each copy of that application will create a transient copy of the subclass of REST services that you've defined as being associated with that application. And then as each request is received from the client, we will call the method on that transient copy of that class. When the reply is sent, there is a property on Jade REST service called HTTP status code, which we will default to 200, meaning okay. Yes, the request succeeded. And it's up to you as the developer, or the application needs to make a decision early on as to what style they're going to use. Are they going to set the status or not? Because if you can't find the client, then you can return null, saying, hey, there isn't a client, and the front end has to interpret that as saying, oh, okay, it's not found. Or you send this guy back as 404 saying not found, and that causes an exception in the C# code, which you then have to handle and deal with. So it becomes a design decision as to how you want to operate. As far as configuration goes, as I said in the Jade HTTP any file, there is a new application type called Jade REST services. And apart from that, all the other parameters are identical. That type of REST services allows the put and the delete type of message through, whereas the standard Jade HTTP messages for any other application type will ignore those two. So the HTTP DLL will pass through the URI and the verb as part of the framework so that we can construct the method that's going to be called and make that available to the developers if they want to see it. There are two different application types similar to web services. One displays the web application monitor, the little window that comes up that you can use to investigate and see how many requests have come through and show each request appearing and all that stuff. And the non-GUI version, which runs as a non-GUI app in the background. Yeah, well, I've got ahead of myself. I've already said all that. We subclass the Jade REST service. We create a transient copy, and that class holds all the methods that we're going to call. So here's an example that I wrote for. I've subclassed Jade REST services, and here I have a list of all the methods defined, and what I've done is define a method for every primitive type, and every primitive type array, and every primitive type null, and a whole bunch of puts in the same manner for person and arrays and so on. So that was a mechanism for testing the environment to make sure that all the primitive types were used and worked correctly. And so if we look at an example of a method for getPerson, you'll see that we have defined it as expecting one parameter, being the ID. So that parameter, that ID must be in the URI. So we will have a URI that has /person/ID, and that ID will be converted to an integer and passed through to the method when it's called. The method somewhere we've presumably in our initialization code, we've set up this global variable called root, by which we go and look up the person. And here it becomes how you want to define it, because we're going to pass back null anyway as the person. If we don't find the person, we're going to pass back null. But you can set that flag as well. Honestly, I'm not sure how you decide how you want to do that. I've seen it from both ends. Okay. The class, the Jade REST service class itself has a couple of other things on it. One is that property that we've talked about already. Another one is an array that you can use to say, when you clean up after the execution of this method, delete these objects because they were transients that I generated during the process. And they might be part of the XML that you've specified. We will automatically delete if you return a transient object as what's being returned from the method, we will pass it into, generate the XML or the JSON from it and then delete it. But if it may have links all over the place to other objects that you've generated during this method execution. And you can just dump them in there to say, clean those up when you finish, please. And you can find out what type of output is expected. I'm not sure how you would use it, but you can find it out. To define the application is pretty much the same as any other application, except there's these new types of REST service application types. And the web tab is disabled, and we end up on the web application tab, which is exactly the same for web services, except for this bottom part. So you define connection name, the number of copies, and all the rest of it, HTTP, HTTPS. And you have to select, in here will be a list of all the subclasses of Jade REST services in this schema or super schemas. And you have to pick one of those to say that's the REST service class that we want to use for this application. And as said, there is no exposure, but I have written, when you click that button, it generates an XML description of the web service with all the methods, the classes that are referenced, and the parameters and so on. I'll show you that in a little bit later. And that should be useful for someone who can take that and implement something at the C# level. The other things that are available on that class are two methods similar to what web services does. When a request is received, we call this method process request. So if you re-implement that on your subclass of Jade REST services, then you can intercept what comes in and do logging, or maybe even fiddle with the data. I don't know, whatever you want to do in there. As long as you call the re-implement inherit method, it will get processed. And similarly, when the reply is about to be sent back to the client, we call the reply method that you can re-implement and do anything you like in there prior to it being sent to the client. Now, I mentioned that there are 3 different types of formats. Unfortunately, JSON, Microsoft JSON and Newtonsoft JSON are not compatible. They are in some areas, but the important ones are not. Anyway, if you specify JSON, which is the default, Microsoft does not allow duplicate references. So if you have an object you want to encode that points to an object that points back to one of the objects you've already seen, that will generate an exception in the C# because it cannot be handled. And if you try to output in Jade, if you generate that environment and try to generate JSON, it will also generate an exception saying, I'm sorry, this can't be handled. But that is the name of the C# class that you need, that will handle the JSON in the C#, in the C# world. That's what you use to convert the JSON into the objects that it contains. XML, there are two forms, unfortunately. Microsoft has a data contract serializer, which you use for objects, and an XML serializer used for primitives. But in their implementation, they missed timestamp interval. So if you want to handle timestamp interval, you have to use the data contract serializer. Maybe they'll fix that in the later releases of Windows, or who knows. Miracles still happen. Okay, so with the XML, objects will automatically be encoded with IDs and circular references. So if you have the same object in that tree that you're exporting more than once, then the first time it will generate the contents of the object. The second time it'll just generate a reference to the ID of that object. And that's all automatically done for you. For a JSON, the Newton soft JSON will handle circular references, and it will encode the IDs into that JSON definition. Now the data that is returned will include all the object properties, regardless of whether they're null or not. There is some concept, I think, in web services of saying don't return things that are null, but anyway, I think it's more straightforward, but you always get the entire contents. For objects, the entire tree is returned. So be very careful about what you send back. If you give it the root object, you might end up trying to send the whole database down the line. That won't succeed, of course. And there is a special case whereby if you return a string from the method that starts with the XML tag, we will just send that as is. So you've got some special case where you were saying, okay, I just want to send the XML that I've generated myself, and then here it goes. And Jade will just hands off and send the string. Okay, all the primitives that are in the methods that have a number of parameters, and all but one are primitives. So we take the URL, we step through them, and they have to match the order of the parameters on that method, of course. You can have a parameterless type, so that means you could have a method that has a variable number of parameters, and the parameterless will be strings, of course, because we don't know what type they are. 0 or 1 object, and that object can appear in any position in the call, in the parameter list, except after a parameterless type, of course. If the URI that is received doesn't match the signature of the method, then you get an exception. Okay, reiterating again, it is stateless. There is no session object. Makes it tricky to deal with, of course, when you're dealing with an ongoing conversation, but that's the definition. Therefore, there is no timeout because there is no session. And you can use the standard web XML configuration file in the Jade, at the Jade end. If you get an exception in the Jade logic, then we send an XML reply describing the error. Anybody tell me why we don't send JSON? If you said you want a JSON reply, I think it's already got it up there. Sorry, I didn't realise. I'd forgotten. we send you a JSON reply, there's nothing on the header to tell you that this is an error, a fault. So there's no way of you knowing that this is not the reply to the method you've sent. So it has to be XML to describe that, hey, we had a problem. When there's no exposure, methods should return either, well, it's up to you to how to design it, but transient copy objects that are only populated with the required data is one option. Special Jade data objects is another option. You can send the persistent objects, but you have to be very careful about what they point to. And there's no namespaces in REST, which affects your C# code. It just means you have to define the definitions at that end saying no namespaces. I mentioned that button on the application definition that says generate description, and it will generate what's called Waddle-like. Waddle was I think it was Sun, tried to come up with an exposure definition for REST, and it hasn't been accepted, it hasn't been adopted by the industry. So I've taken that, and there are some aspects that are not exactly Waddle, but what this file is a representation of all the methods that are being called, what their verb is, their noun, the parameters that are associated, that are defined for that method, whether it needs, this is my invention, if you call it that, whether it needs an object, and then a description of the classes that might be received either way. Subclasses of person, and so on. So that could be parsed and made use of in the C# end to automate the creation of the structures somehow. Okay, enough of talk. Demo is only quite short because there's not a lot to see, but we will show it in action. Is that resolution enough? Okay. Right, so here's that REST service that I talked about, and
Maybe a bit more.
a bit more? Okay. Okay, there's GetBinary. Let's look at the push. Test object here has a property that's every primitive type has an array, and every primitive type is a property as well. So basically that object, you send that object, you get every primitive type and every primitive type array sent back and forth. And my put object, my put test object passes a test object and optionally some parameters, and I don't know what the rest of the code does, but it basically just spins it round and returns it back again. So the front end I've written, I have to remember to run the application. So we have a little monitor app sitting up there, and this guy has a section at the middle. This section here is the XML that will be sent from the client to, because we're doing a put. This put up here is saying we're doing a put. We're saying return type is here is test object, and we execute that, and because it's the first one, it took a little bit longer. And this utility actually compares what was received against what's expected. So it will actually tell you whether it failed or not. So what we've got here is the XML that we received back again. It's laid out slightly differently from what Microsoft coded the XML description here. If I did a character, an array, executed that, I haven't implemented that method, we needed to do get. So we've got back an array of characters, and we go here, we say we want that back as Microsoft JSON, and that's how it looks in Microsoft JSON, and it's probably pretty much the same in Newton. Oh no, Newton's different again. Newton format for an array is different. Okay, so that if we go back to our put of object, test object, and we say we want it in JSON, you can see what we're going to send there is in JSON this time, and that's what we got back, coded up by Jade into JSON. And if we do the same, I should be wearing my glasses, is that double N or is that single N? Aha. Okay. Now if I try to send a circular person, we get an exception when we're in Microsoft JSON, because C# says, hang on, you've got a circular reference here, I can't handle that. Whereas if we go to Newton, you can see that in there we've got tags associated with each object pointing to the original definition of the object that we encoded. And finally, we'll run it more than once. That button there runs 254 requests to Jade to do all those gets and puts that I was talking about, and sending test objects, primitives, and various other things. It's done, we'll do it again, it'll be faster the second time because it's speeded up and on. This is not running the optimized binaries or anything like that, but we're getting 245 a second through one copy of Jade sent serially. Our tests of the performance seem to indicate that it's about twice the speed of the web service infrastructure. So obviously the speed is going to depend on what you do with the method, but just getting the messages back and forth, it seems to be about twice what you would get through SOAP, things like that. That's about it. Questions?
Yeah, Bob, the JSON parser and generating, is that available on a separate class in standalone?
No. I laugh because every time this is the third time I've presented this, and that's always the first question. And John is not here. John Ashcroft needs to be noted that this is a ongoing request. So I anticipate this will be John. So this is the third time we've done this presentation, and every time I get asked the same question: will the JSON parser be available as a separate class entity that we can call? And I'm saying it's not currently, but we mean to think about the need for that.
Yeah, we just had that come up last week, even just in our J6.3.
Right.
Obviously, it's not going to be
Yeah. Not in the initial 7.1 release, let's put it that way.
okay, thanks.
Any other questions?
If you don't want to send back the whole object the whole way down,
Mhm.
you can't turn stuff on and off, can you? So you have to create a transient of that
Correct.
class and then just populate the ones you want.
Yep.
And then it will still return blanks and nulls for all the rest of the attributes. Even if there's another 200 and you only want 2, it will still return 200 nulls.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, originally, the way I originally implemented it, I didn't send nulls back, and I decided that was too confusing. But, you know, there's scope for suggestions. People want things differently.
Presumably that XML that you can generate, that sort of gives a bit of an idea of what's in there. The JSON follows that same order and sequencing of the bits that's in. So if you add a new attribute to your class and they're getting JSON back, they'll be totally confused, obviously, but you can regenerate that XML.
Oh, the JSON has the property names in it.
But is it? I thought it had
Yeah.
just commas and brackets.
But if we look at the header of the JSON here, there's nothing to say that this is a test object. But you can see, hopefully, you can see that. So you have description, forenames, and so on, country of birth. So the property names are there, but not the description of this is a test object or whatever it is. You just have to make the assumption that it is. Thank you.